Hello, good day and welcome to this session on identifying non-conformances. By the end of this session, you should be able to state the general rule of contract as well as explain breach of contract and finally differentiate between substantial performance and partial performance. So the general rule of contract stipulates that a contract is discharged only when both parties have complied completely, accurately, and exactly with the terms of the contract. So, contracts are meant to be executed. So, in general, the execution or discharge by performance, the contract is said to have been discharged by performance when, for instance, in a typical buyer-supplier relationship, the supplier promises to deliver X amount of goods to the buyer at X time. Then the buyer agrees to pay X amount of money to the supplier when they provide the goods and services at the allocated time. So performance, in terms of the general rule, is only recognized when the supplier provides the X amount of goods at the X time to the buyer and the buyer pays the X amount of money to the supplier. That is the general rule of contract. So general rule of contract performance. However, there are certain exceptions to the general rule of contract performance, and in such situations or in such exceptions, the affected party in such a relationship may sue the other party for quantum merit to claim compensation for partial performance. So quantum merit basically refers to a claim for the value of work that one has done to another party, or a claim for partial performance rather than a claim for the full contract price. So when either parties are unable to completely and accurately execute full performance, the other party may accept partial performance. And partial performance is an exception to the general rule of full performance, where one party only performs a portion of their obligations, and acceptance of this partial performance is subject to payment for the partial work done. So if the other party is aggrieved for the partial performance done by the other party, they may sue for quantum merit. So in a typical buyer-supplier relationship where possibly buyers agree to supply 1,000 tons of a product to a buyer, but they only supply maybe 100 or 200 tons to the buyer. The buyer could decide that they are accepting the 200 tons, but they may decide not to pay the full amount of the 200 tons. So maybe the 1,000 tons was valued at 100,000 Ghana cedis, implying that the 200 tons that has been supplied would be valued at 20% of that 1,000. The buyer may decide that due to the inconvenience that the supplier has caused them, they wouldn't pay for the 20% of the 1,000 that they would have otherwise paid if they are confidently accepting partial performance, but rather they will pay less than 20% as a form of compensation for delays in supply as well as for the incomplete delivery. So if the buyer accepts partial performance, they wouldn't necessarily be obliged to pay for full amount of valuing the 200 tons. So the damages that the buyer claims in such an instance is what we call the quantum merit. Then substantial performance. In the earlier example given, where they require 1,000 tons, but they supply 200 tons, that is seen to be partial performance, and in the end, the supplier would not pay the full amount of the 200 tons, but they would deduct an amount for the full 200 tons that was supplied in the form of quantum merits. But substantial performance is where the buyer requested for 1,000 tons, but the supplier was only able to provide maybe 900 tons. In this instance, the buyer will accept that the supplier has been able to provide 1,000, more than half of the 1,000 tons that they requested. So they would pay for the full amount. If they accepted, they will pay for the full 900 tons that will be supplied to them, and then less the 100 tons extra that is absent in the expected performance. So frustration of a contract is designed to reduce the severity of the general rule where failure to perform the contract is subject to suing for damages as well as ending the contract. So frustration allows the other party to be considered in situations where their failure was as a result of situations that are beyond their control. That is where frustration comes in. So if the aggrieved party receives a given amount of benefits, they are required to pay a fair sum of money for those services that they have received from that relationship. So mostly frustration of contract arises as a result of unexpected circumstances, and therefore for any of the parties to not suffer for any reliabilities that might arise as a result of contract execution, and therefore frustrate the contract, parties are allowed to incorporate certain clauses which are known as the force majeure clauses. These clauses sort of exude the other party from liability in situations where their failure to perform a contract results from circumstances which are unforeseeable and for which they are not responsible and they could not have avoided or overcome. So these clauses helps them to escape the liabilities that they would have otherwise suffered for some of these unexpected occurrences. So a breach of contract refers to an unjustifiable failure to perform the terms of a contract or violation of a contract through failure to perform or through interference with the performance of the contract's obligations. One of the breaches is what we term as anticipatory breach. So anticipatory breach occurs where probably you have agreed that you will supply product in 2 weeks time to a buyer, but after 1 week you realize that given how things are going, you may not be able to execute the contract in the second week. So you tell the buyer that you can't execute the contract. In one way or the other, you have failed to perform the contract, and this constitutes breach. But you have given prior notice and you didn't wait till that 2 weeks notice, and this is termed as anticipatory breach. So in this session, you have basically learned about the general rule of contract, breach of contract, as well as the difference between substantial performance and partial performance. Thank you.